Please, of course, silence all cell phones. You are welcome to take video and photo clips with your phone, and if you post them, we hope that you'll tag us. But we do prefer you experience the performance live with your fullest human attention. Please no flash on your photos. And thank you, and enjoy the show.
I'm going to talk a little while about intelligence, what we mean when we talk about it, and how it seems to be playing, how those ideas of it seem to be playing out in the world. And I'm going to start that story here. This is a lake in Epirus in northern Greece. I live in Greece. I'm from the UK, but I've lived in Greece for almost 8 years now. And Epirus is right up in the north against the Albanian border. And it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. It's really quite stunning. It's a landscape of mountains and little villages, and it's not heavily populated, and it nourishes some of the most important populations of bears, wolves, eagles, Dalmatian pelicans, and all kinds of other critters still going around in Europe. And it's a wonderful place that I love very much. And I was up there a couple of years ago, and I went for a walk in these woods, and what I found was lots of these things. These little wooden stakes stuck into the ground, marked with little sprays of spray paint, and tagged with these numbers, could read, or didn't understand what they resembled. And as I walked through the woods, I kept finding more and more of these stakes marked out across the ground, realising, in fact, that they ran further than I could walk, and in fact, in subsequent days, driving around, saw them on trees and on fences, realising that they actually composed a vast grid that had been superimposed on the landscape as if by some kind of alien superintelligence, which is what was going on. Just what I was seeing on the ground was a survey grid, as they're doing a series of kind of seismic explorations through the region to try and find deposits of oil and gas. But there are also the tooth and claw marks of an artificial intelligence, because that's how oil and gas exploration works these days. The company that's doing the exploration up in Epirus, a Spanish company called Repsol, have long-standing partnerships with IBM, with Microsoft, with Google, with all the large corporations that you know about making AI, to use this technology, this thing we call AI, it's mostly just really fast, expensive computers, in order to make their operations more efficient, to better evaluate the value of oil reserves below the ground, to basically make the process of extracting and burning oil ever more efficient. Which, let's face it, seems like the most stupid possible thing we could be doing in the present. That the process of extracting and burning every single remaining drop of oil under the ground will doom many kinds of life that exist in the present. And so there seems to be something fundamentally wrong with our very idea of what intelligence is.
And so there seems to be something fundamentally wrong with our very idea of what intelligence is.
And so there seems to me something fundamentally wrong with our very idea of what intelligence is.
And so there seems to be something fundamentally wrong with our very idea of what intelligence is, if this is what we're putting artificial intelligence to use to do.
You have a friend on you today. I don't know if you could feel her. And I am noticing them for the first time.
I was thinking about that the other day.
Know
how much there's to consider.
What kind of friend it is.
It's a really so much question.
And
through the eyes,
I don't know what it means to know. I think
so through the hands.
for me, I'm saying,
Between,
I haven't met them
and
before, I haven't seen that particular
there's,
pattern
let's see that you're
before.
and
The,
black soil. And you
I-
say rooted in the
so
ground.
humans
And I can see
taken
that
up the vibe
because we
of
have
the
certain
space.
way
and
of,
actually take information in and understand
well, it's
what
like,
happens to them. They build maps,
it's like
patterns
sitting in the way back of the car, looking at the
shortcuts
clouds and trying to figure
to
out.
understanding things.
Or the
So
way
that
your
the
root
next time
knows where
they
the water
see that,
is.
it's a little bit,
It's like,
they quote unquote know it, but perhaps they actually know less of it because they are
are you in there?
mapping to something else that was
What do you think?
losing some of the
Am
information
I
that was there in that moment.
seeing you? Okay,
Um,
back of seeing, the
I
other
don't
eyes,
know
you feel that you're
where
prickly.
it's stored.
No,
That's
it's
a good
smooth.
question. You have, some of it is stored color in my body.
I need,
I mean, I guess all of it has to
Oxygen.
be stored in my body
you need
in the sense that all of it is
what comes from my oxygen.
physical.
I experience everything.
We've got something very wrong in our idea of what all of technology is for. But I think particularly worryingly this concept of intelligence is just heading in the wrong direction, let's be clear. Which kind of should be to be almost exclusively being developed as a tool to remove human joy and to replace us in various ways and ultimately to supplant us. Which again seems not very intelligent, at least from our perspective. And once again it seems that there's something very out of whack about this. And what I've come to think about that is when you understand that artificial intelligence is something that is broadly put into practice as something acquisitive, industrial, to make profits, to decrease the joy in human life, and to pay people less, pay people less, pay people less, pay people less. And you understand that it's not intelligence that's at work here, but a very narrow version of intelligence, which you can think of essentially as corporate intelligence. It's the intelligence of a corporation. It's what a corporation thinks is intelligence. It's what a very narrow view of business success looks like. And that's mostly what we're talking about when we talk about AI. We're talking about automating various forms of mostly quite acquisitive business that are dedicated to profit maximization, rather than any other particularly variable that might benefit us in the world. And that seems to me to be both hugely problematic for all the dangers that it causes and all the damage that it's doing, but also just like the most colossal failure of imagination. Just a really weak attempt on our part to think about what intelligence itself might be. And as I started to think about that more and more, I started to try and ask that question of what an intelligence actually is. And one of the strange things when you start talking about intelligence is that actually, despite all this talking we do about it, there's really not any good solid definition of it. There's lots of terms that people use, things like theory of mind, planning ahead, being able to solve certain complex problems, forms of communication, memory, and you can take a grab bag of these qualities depending on how you want to construct an idea of intelligence. But really the working definition of intelligence for us most of the time is what humans do, right? And that's also our vision of what we think AI was going to be. That's the kind of science fiction version of AI, that'll be a version of the human. In the first place, turns out artificial intelligence, whatever it is not really like human intelligence at all. It's something quite different. It's behaving in very different ways. It thinks in entirely different ways to us. It's very good at certain things that we're not very good at. And it's terrible at things that we find very easy. It thinks about the world differently, which is not really surprising when you think it's basically locked in small boxes in large corporate offices. And at the same time, in the last 20 to 30 years, there's been this incredible flowering of research and understanding of non-human intelligence, of what intelligence looks like beyond the human. And that's where I want to go with thinking a bit about, what
a planetary intelligence or other forms of intelligence might actually be more interesting than this. As I said, one of the problems we've had for so long is that we tend to define intelligence as being what humans do, and it colors our ability to recognize intelligence when it's done differently. Classic examples of this is all of the kind of tests that humans do on other animals to see if they're worthy of joining the club, right? Which we don't really want them to do. We barely let most humans join that club. So the idea that non-humans might do it is a kind of existential threat to us, it feels like a lot of the time. And yet, they do all kinds of amazing things. But we're really bad at seeing it. And one of my favorite examples of that is gibbons. So one of the classic tests of intelligence is tool use. So you provide an animal, usually locked safely in a cage, with some kind of tool, and then you place a nice treat outside their cage, and if they can use the stick to get the treat, or whatever variation on that is. We've been doing this with animals for decades, and mostly with creatures that are genetically close to us, with the apes and various monkeys. And most of them are pretty good at this. It seems like quite a simple thing. Gorillas and orangutans and chimps, and also bonobos and macaques and quite a lot of monkeys are very good at this. But for some reason, for years, gibbons just were not interested. They just absolutely refused to participate in this. And this was a problem for science and for our understanding what intelligence is, or at least kind of various forms of brain development, because bonobos are in the middle of that list of other animals that I mentioned. And so if intelligence has worked its way up through our lineage, with us, of course, perched happily at the top, then they should be intelligent, but they refuse to do this test. Until one day, someone had the bright idea of redesigning the test in some way. And what they did was that they took those sticks that had been lying on the ground, and they hung them from the top of the enclosure. And as soon as the gibbons saw that, they immediately went, oh. And in that moment, they became intelligent in our eyes, right? They passed the test. And the basis for that was that we redesigned the test to acknowledge a different form of intelligence, to acknowledge a different form of intelligence, to acknowledge a different form of intelligence. Because gibbons are brachiators, right? They spend most of their time up in the trees and swinging around. An intelligence that's patterned in correlation with their body, so that their awareness of the world and their focus of problem solving is oriented to a different pattern of awareness than those of us who walk around on the ground. And so that they inhabit a different sensory universe, and thus their intelligence has a different form and shape. And that's one of the first real lessons about these intelligences, that when thinking about other intelligence, is that intelligence is embodied, and it's part of one's experience. It's not something that just exists inside the head or inside the brain, but is something that is part of one's pattern of life. It's relational. It exists as an interaction with the world around oneself that's also deeply matters how you inhabit a body and how you inhabit the world. And so immediately you can see that different forms of creature who have different lives and different body patterns will do intelligence differently to how humans or other creatures do it. And that gets really interesting when you start to look at creatures that are very differently embodied and socialized and everything else to us. The octopuses, I'm sure you've heard these stories, because the octopus is having a bit of a moment at the moment. They're intelligent celebrities at the moment. But they are really brilliant. It's impossible not to talk about them. But because they are so radically different to us. And I want to highlight this quality of difference of intelligence and why it matters to think about it. Like, it's hard to think of a creature with a recognizably largish brain that is as different to us on this planet than the octopus. But of course we are related to it, because everything on Earth has a kind of last common ancestor. And ours and the octopus's is about 14 billion years ago. And it was probably some kind of blind flatworm that lived on the bottom of the ocean. But we both come from that blind flatworm, right? Along two totally separate branches of the evolutionary tree. And yet there are these marked differences. The eye of the octopus, for example, is very similar to ours. It's a kind of round orb filled with gel with a lens and rods and cones and all that stuff. It's in fact slightly better than ours, because the optic nerves joins differently, so it doesn't have the little blind spot that humans and other apes have in their vision. But it's very like our eye, but it evolved completely separately. It's what's called parallel evolution. So totally separately, the forces of evolution converged on this particular tool for seeing and engaging with the world. And certain people are making the argument, I would make the argument, that the same thing is occurring with intelligence in this case. That even though 28 million years, 14 million years all the way down that way, 14 million years all the way back up there, separate us and the octopus, this intelligence has evolved differently in these different cases. Evolved differently in different species, but evolved everywhere. And this whole hierarchical notion we have of intelligence as being a kind of a thing that rises up towards some point, once again high us at the top, is a huge mistake. And belongs in the trash can with the whole idea of the tree of evolution, which has also, I won't go into in such detail now, but has also been felled, if that you didn't know that. It simply doesn't work that way in terms of vertical hierarchies, and that's the thing we've been learning. Once you start to go into these kind of strange abilities, it gets really interesting indeed, because it also goes way beyond the animal. One of my favorite scientific experiments from a few years ago was when scientists took a bunch of cress plants and they recorded the sound of caterpillars munching on the leaves. And then they took the caterpillars away. And then they played that sound to a bunch of other cress plants. And monitoring the chemicals in their leaves, they realized that the plants immediately flooded their leaves with a kind of toxin which is meant to deter the caterpillars. And everyone was like, oh, excuse me, the plants are listening, they can hear, and they can hear, plants can hear. And we don't really know how. In fact, we have no real idea. We don't know what the mechanism is. And it's one of these things that sort of confounds not just what we thought the plants were doing, because apparently they're listening, but also our method for going about and understanding the world, because historically, botany and most of the natural sciences, they proceed on a kind of hypothesis basis, where you presume an ability and then you design a bunch of tests around it. But when the plants just demonstrate this ability for us, but for themselves, in ways that kind of defy our usual desire to cut them into tiny pieces and figure out how they resemble tiny robots, we don't really know how to respond. It demands a kind of different relationship with them, as does the effect that plants remember. So there's a scientist called Monica Galliano, who I'm only going to tell half her story to save time, but I'll happily talk about her work a bit more in the Q&A, perhaps. What Galliano did was she took a bunch of mimosa plants. So if you don't know mimosas, they're these little kind of plants, nice flowers, and these tiny little kind of stripped leaves. But they're very unique in that they're one of the few plants that moves at a speed that humans can really notice. They're also known as touch-me-not plants, because if you touch the leaf, they'll, at that speed, curl up very quickly. So you can see their reaction, which is quite unusual for plants. So they're quite good for various types of experiments. And what Galliano did was she took a bunch of these plants and she put them in a pot on a little rail with a little foam pad about 10 centimeters below, and she dropped them like that. And the plant would immediately close up and didn't like to shut. And she'd do it again. She'd do it over and over again. And she found that after sometimes only 3 or 4 times, sometimes longer, the plant would stop closing up. And she did a bunch of other checks to test it wasn't just tired, right? To check that by different stimuli, it would still close up. It was only this stimuli, when repeated, it would stop doing this response to. And also, she also left some of these plants for weeks and months and tested them again later and they still remember. And once again, we have no idea how they're doing it. And it's like, of course, it was an experiment that was almost impossible to construct along standard biological or botanical principles. It didn't propose a framework of which to understand. It was more just a plant. Let's treat it as an organism, as a creature that has its own life and awareness and being, and see what happens when it experiences the world in a particular way. As I said, there's more to that story, but I'm not going to tell it now. But plants hear, and they remember. They also do all kinds of other things. First, plants can smell. They have a kind of quite large range of senses. But they do certain kinds of planning. They have proprioception, which is what we call our ability to know where bits of ourselves are without seeing them. They have a whole bunch of kind of experimental results that this can show that plants are capable of things that we simply have no idea they would do. And we'll never know, right? This is one of the other interesting things about it that I'm doing. It's impossible, like we can imagine, like what it might be like to be a baboon, or a macaque, or a bonobo, or a gibbon, that's what I was actually trying to remember, a gibbon. And even an octopus, maybe 3D, but the experience of being a plant is completely impossible and alien to us. And so it throws up some really interesting questions about how we think about experiencing the world, about being intelligent, about having a sense of the world that plants have, right? How do you construct that intelligence? Plants hear and sense the world in various ways, which means they share the world with us, right? We live in a shared world, right? We live in a shared world. We acknowledge that everyone around us is experiencing that world. That is not the same as the world that we experience, but because we're all mostly human, we can make a kind of composite version. But we really have to start to come to terms with the idea of a world that's composed of so many radically different perceptions of the world, many of which are completely inaccessible to us, and will always remain so. And yet, they exist. We share a world in which all of those perceptions are in play all the time, even if we're not able to imagine ourselves into them. One more crazy, weird critter story, and I'll talk about a different aspect of this. This is a slime mold. Slime molds are difficult because they don't even fit into any of the categories. They used to be considered fungi, but they're not fungi. They're not algae or something else either. They trouble all our species definitions. They also trouble our definitions of what constitutes an individual, because sometimes they split up into single-celled creatures like mealy, and sometimes they come together in great kind of floating sacks of protoplasm filled with like free roaming nucleuses. And some of those will sacrifice themselves for other bits of the future community, whatever it is. So they have all these strange qualities, and very interesting science, and also break science in really interesting ways. One of their particularly interesting qualities is that they're very good at finding the most efficient route between different things. So if you put them on a petri dish with a few like dots of food, they'll work out what is the most kind of shortest route between those things. A few years ago, some researchers in Tokyo did this where they put oat flakes, which the slime mold loves, on a little dish in the shape of the major metropolitan areas surrounding Tokyo. And they also show lights in various places to represent kind of rivers and natural obstacles, mountains, because they don't like light very much. And within 24 hours, the slime mold basically recreated the Tokyo Metro rail network, which is a neat trick. It was even more surprising when researchers tested on a thing called the travelling salesman problem. Fairly relatively simple problem to explain, in that imagine you have to visit 6 cities, and you want to figure out what's the shortest route to visit all of them in one go without revisiting them. It's actually a big money problem to make logistics companies and stuff. It's computationally incredibly hard. Computers and humans really suck at this problem because there's no shortcut. You basically have to count all of the routes, which means you need to calculate. If you've got 5 cities, that's 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 route. If you have one more city, it's 6 times 5 times 4 times 3 times 2 times 1 routes. Right? And that means the graph of how hard that problem is to solve goes like this. Right? It just gets harder and harder. It's called exponentially hard. Humans, computers suck at it. Slime molds don't. They solve the problem in linear time. The graph looks like that. It doesn't get harder for them, and we don't understand why. But it's a really long-standing problem in mathematics, and these single-celled creatures are better at solving it than either us or the most powerful supercomputers we've ever built. And as I say, it's probably just like a party trick for them. It's just something that they do. And I'm really interested then in the question of what else can they do that we don't know how to ask them, right? That we don't relate to them in ways that will actually recognize the problems that they themselves are solving, that perhaps that we also struggle to do. The broader arc of what I've been saying so far is that this hierarchical conception of the world that we have around intelligence, but kind of pretty much everything else, is falling apart, it's collapsing. The idea, anything resembling a higher intelligence, or particularly the uniqueness of human intelligence, no longer holds. It's simply not the case. It's not what's happening in the world. It's not what we can observe. And that calls for a fairly radical rethinking of how we relate to everything else in the world. Not least because perhaps we have something to learn. It's pretty obvious that the focus on human uniqueness and the particular ways in which we do intelligence, and considering that to be special and unique, has had pretty disastrous effects on how we live upon this planet. And I think it's somewhat crucial that we reimagine our relationships to everything else, based on a whole bunch of principles, not just that they're smart. But I think intelligence is a really interesting and useful way of seeing the ways in which they have something to teach us, whether it's the slime mods, whether it's something else we have yet to figure out how to ask. We live on a world of multiple forms of intelligence, of multiple ways of thinking about the world. And as we struggle to think about our world in so many ways, how to act, how to change, how to be different, then the realizations of how many other kinds of thinking are available to us, if we pay attention to them and start thinking about them, seems like a fairly primary issue to me. And there's kind of two ways that I go about doing this. The first is how to change, how to make a change in what the sociologist Raymond Williams called the structure of feeling, right? Like how we exist in the world, how we embody, how our relationships work, which is a necessary precondition for making larger scale change. And the second thing is like how to actually make that change, what changes based on this kind of awareness might actually look like. As the world is heating up, ecosystems are essentially moving, right? You understand this is that as it's getting warmer in various places, that temperature and various other things are moving across the surface of the planet. And so that if you stay in one place, that place is going to get warmer. If you move with the temperature change, then you will actually basically stay within your own ecosystem. At the time of writing, the global average mean, the global mean average speed of climate change is about 0.42 kilometers per year, which is 115 centimeters per day. That's how fast you have to move to stay in the same ecological conditions. And that varies widely. If you're starting in the middle of a desert, in the middle of the planet, you've actually got quite a long way to run. If you're already halfway up a mountain, because this is moving towards the poles and it's moving upwards, you're going to run out of space very quickly. And so some things I do are things like this, which is to take a bamboo rod. I took it out in my garden, and I literally moved the plant, a few of the plants in my garden, 115 centimeters north. In order to understand a little bit of a change in our relationships, a change in how that we need to think, not just as humans, but as other creatures in responding to this. Because plants have been responding to climate change for tens of thousands of years. After the last ice age, the forests of Europe regrew from the south in only a couple of tens of thousands of years. Trees were capable of responding to changes in climatic conditions far faster than human migration actually occurred. We don't think of plants as being on the move, but in fact they're on the move again now. Huge tree migrations and other plant migrations are in process right now. Across Europe and North America, deciduous trees are largely moving westwards and northwestwards because it's not just temperature, it's wetness and other things as well. And coniferous plants are largely moving north at speeds of 10 to 20, 30 kilometers a year in some places. And so there's this change that's occurring all around us, but that we're not aware of. Still for us, climate change so often seems to be something that's happening completely in the abstract. And becoming aware of things like plant migration, or even just doing those few little steps, to me is a way of creating a new kind of form of awareness that is not the same as plant or other animal awarenesses, but is connected to it in interesting ways. And you could see from the beginning of my talk how you could see I could be going that kind of direction with AI, but I have some counterexamples. Because we've used technology in all kinds of ways throughout history to give us this kind of view. We have a choice over how we use the material of our technologies, but we also have a choice about how we think and the metaphors that we gain from this. Something very interesting has happened. As I said, there's this incredible moment that we're going through now that AI is having this kind of cultural moment, and it's making us all think about intelligence just at the moment that we start to become aware. And this isn't the first time something like that has happened. That actually it seems to me that there is a connection between the things that we make and the thoughts that we are capable of thinking. When the internet was first being developed, it presented mathematicians with a bunch of quite interesting questions because the networks that we built didn't work like networks that had been made previously. So researchers were just starting to become aware of the ways in which trees communicate and connect underground. What we've discovered in recent decades is that trees connect through what are called mycelial networks, essentially fungal networks that connect their roots. They connect across species, they connect particularly strongly with their own descendants, but they connect onto broader networks than that. They share nutrients, they also share information. If one tree is being harmed by insects, it will signal through this network to allow other trees to defend itself. When some trees lose their leaves in winters, the coniferous trees, which keeps their leaves, will give nutrients to the broadleaf trees across species, and the reverse will happen there. All of this is going on, and it's been going on forever, for longer than we've been on this planet, but we've been capable of seeing it until we had an understanding of how networks functioned. And I don't mean that in the abstract. The people who developed the first theories of what is amusingly sometimes called the Wood Wide Web were people working in some of the institutions that were first connected to the internet, right? They were people who were given the metaphors of the network that were provided by the development of technology. Those metaphors, that way of seeing the world as something network, didn't exist before. And not only that, but the mathematics of network theory allowed them to analyze the actual material transfers that were going on between the trees. They used the math that was developed for computer networks to make visible and make comprehensible the natural networks, which is not to say the two things are equivalent. The tree network is not like the internet. We could have a whole other discussion about why computational metaphors for things are wrong. But it's similar enough that we can use one idea to think about the other. And that seems to me to be a fascinating process. That there is this, we seem to have the need to create kind of toy versions of the world in order to create a model of it in our own minds that then allows us to see the world around us. That, whether that's a quirk of uniquely human intelligence or something bigger, who really knows. But it's, to finish, it's my hope, or it's my idea, a hopeful one, that maybe that's what's happening with AI. That considered differently, considered not as a kind of acquisitive, corporate, aggressive AI that's here to beat us at chess and then take us jobs and then eventually convert us into some kind of fuel. AI is actually here to force us to recognize that there are other forms of intelligence in play. If AI is not human intelligence, then more than one kind of intelligence exists. And if more than one kind of intelligence, then potentially infinite. And it seems to be incredibly significant that just at the moment that we're starting to recognize these multiple forms of intelligence in our own creation, we're becoming aware that much vaster worlds are potentially far more interesting and certainly longer lived and more urgent of our attention intelligences that have surrounded us all along. Because a new Copernican moment looms in our future, a moment when, once again, the centrality of human existence is not off its course. Through our own actions, both through the development of high technologies, through the rapid expansion of capitalism, and through the destruction of it's doing to the planet. And we require this kind of urgent rethinking that also is going to require urgent form of solidarity with all the other beings we share this planet with.